Welcome, everybody. I'm excited for a bit of a little experiment we've got going on the Coaching Culture podcast today. We had recently done a Q&A back earlier in this fall, and the listeners loved it. And I said, let's step it up a notch. Let's do a live Q&A. Let's actually get our listeners on the podcast today to ask us some questions. Many of these listeners are some familiar faces for myself, Nate, and Betsy. And so we're excited to have them in part of the conversation today. So for today's recording, what we're going to do is we're just going to move around the room. We have asked our guests to come with a question for us, and myself, Nate, and Betsy will respond to that. And at the end, we're going to take a few minutes to actually ask all of our listeners to share a little bit on their thoughts on coaching on a particular topic that maybe I'm actually really curious to hear everybody's perspective on. So welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name's JP Nerbun.
I'm Nate Sanderson.
And I am Betsy Butterick.
Well done. All right. The mission of this podcast is to help leaders grow and build better cultures. If you want to learn more about TOC, you can head on over to tocculture.com. And you can also learn more about Betsy and her work as a leadership coach at betsybutterick.com. Let's jump into our conversation today with the group. And we're going to go over to a good friend, familiar face, Brennan. Brennan, welcome. Share us what's going on for you and what question you got for the group here.
Yeah, so I just finished up my first year as a head coach for high school football. And, with being the first year and starting a new program and everything, you always run into kind of resistance to change, whether that be from the athletes or from parents or just community members in general or administration. I haven't really ran into resistance to change with the administration, but I know that could be a big part of it as well. So I'll throw that into the question. But, how do you navigate kind of the resistance to change when you're trying to promote new ideas, new culture, and all those different aspects that come with that? And how do you navigate that with the conversations? And, there's always going to be pushback with anything you try to change. So just curious on your guys' thoughts on how we could navigate that moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Brennan, we've talked a lot about this over the last couple of years. And I think for me, whenever we've started somewhere new, understanding why we're doing what we're doing and what our values are and what those look like in terms of actual behaviors in practice or a film session or, what those expectations are. And then the more consistent you can be from day one, obviously you're going to make adjustments as you go along, as you learn things about the culture of the building and your players and your parent community. But if you can be consistent to the values that you say are the most important, I think over time that begins to build credibility and really a strong foundation for moving forward.
Yeah. And I guess that's kind of part of my personal experience where I've struggled a little bit is, the credibility, because I'm just a younger coach. So I don't have that background of like years of credibility to fall back on, and so that's been another hoop to jump through for myself personally.
Brennan, I'm a big fan of naming what's true. And this lowers barriers. It breaks down resistance. For you to make that vulnerable admission of, hey, I know I'm new here. I'm in my first year, and while I don't know blank, or I don't yet know blank, here's what I do know. And then taking a page from Adam Grant in his book, Think Again, he talks about how anytime there's going to be change, it can be helpful to tell folks what's not going to change. So, well, we're going to implement a new offense, or I'm a new face, or we're going to do things differently than what you're used to. Here's what's not going to change. What's not going to change is our commitment to a great student athlete experience. What's not going to change is our quest to be the most competitive unit that we can be. So anytime things are going to be different, naming what's going to be different, and also it might sound like stating the obvious, but throwing it out there, any resistance that you're aware of, oh, he's a young coach, he doesn't know what he's doing. Like, own that. Yeah, I'm a young coach and I'm still learning, and I'm excited to learn with the people that are part of this program. And here's what that's going to look like.
Brennan, what's the hardest part about this resistance for you?
Yeah, like I said, for my side, it's not really administration, and it's honestly not too much the kids that are the resistance. It's more the adults, community members, parents, that side of things that, they have traditions and they have the way they think that it should be done. And they kind of fall sometimes into that, the most dangerous phrase in the English language, that we've always done it that way. They kind of fall into that trap from time to time.
What does that resistance feel like if you had to name that resistance? Give it a name.
For me, pressure to, I better be right with the change that I'm trying to implement.
Yeah. So if you've got this pressure to like make the right decision, it sounds like it would be really difficult. You feel like you can't make mistakes in the job, a job
Right.
that you're just brand new and fresh to with little experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I would share this, Brennan. Like, I think one thing is just come in and just name that I'm going to make mistakes. Like, I think there's a part of us that just wants to pretend and like not talk about the elephant in the room. Like, I'm a first-year head coach. Let's just start from I would just start from place of like, I'm going to make mistakes. My goal is not to be mistakeless or perfect. It is to learn as quickly as I can. And so I think people can forgive people that make mistakes. I think a lot of good people can. I think it's less that they become less forgiving when we make the same mistake over and over. So it's just about how fast can we learn, and so try to create some feedback loops. I think the other thing too, that I like, the general advice I would give on this is stuff that came from, I've learned from Monty Williams and from Jack Easterby, two friend mentors of mine and their work there. And I think Monty did something when he started over at the Suns. He started from a place of, this program hasn't been, or this team hasn't been very successful in one area, but there's still a lot of good here. So it's just, hey, what can we do to cultivate the good that's already there? Rather than coming in and just criticizing and talking about all the things that need to change, and then allowing others to really dictate and drive that change. What ideas do they have? And, really trying to throw, questions to them and allow them to be a part of the changes that do take place.
Brennan, I'll add one more anecdote here. When I started at Mount Vernon, we did a big parent meeting for our youth program and talked about our values. And, we want to create this great experience for kids and use the sport to grow them. And, one of the dads came up to me about 4 months later after the end of that season. And he's like, hey, I just want you to know, I left that meeting and I went and found somebody that I knew you coached their kids before. And I said, is this guy full of shit? Or like, what is, because people throw those phrases around. But then he said, but I saw that it was real for you. And now it's real for our kids, so there is an aspect of you're asking people to buy in before there's evidence that this is going to work or the process is going to pay off. But you have to stay true to what you believe is going to be best for the program, right? And your mission in that program. And eventually you'll start to build allies that will defend you even when you're not, in the conversations that are happening around your program.
Yeah. You're exactly right.
All right. What's your biggest takeaway, Brennan, that you're going to walk away with?
Yeah. I mean, I think it reminds me of, I can't think of the guy's name, the art of negotiation guy, just labeling it.
Chris Voss. Yeah.
Chris Voss. Yeah. It's kind of just goes to labeling, getting ahead of them and labeling my vulnerabilities and the things that they're already thinking in their head, going ahead and getting those out there ahead of time and attacking it from that perspective. And then that vulnerability has been shared, just like you guys said, emphasizing that, I'm going to be learning all along and learning as quickly as possible and always trying to do the right thing, make the right decision.
That's great. Thanks for coming on, Brennan, and sharing that question. Hang around here. We'll be tapping into your wisdom here in a second. We're going to head on over to Todd. Todd, thanks for joining us. What's troubling you, or what's on your mind?
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I feel like I'm talking to friends. I listen to you guys so much. I'm a homeschool volleyball coach, volleyball director. And one of the issues we run into is when the parents don't take practice and matches even seriously, right? They're used to the flexibility of being homeschooled, so they do what they want. And I've built parent guides and player guides, talking about commitment, but I need to enforce it more without punishing the athletes for decisions from their parents, right? So I struggle with trying to instill commitment. I mean, we have plenty of players that are committed, but there's, a few families that they'll just say, I'm not coming to practice today. No reasoning, right? So we struggle with that. And I'm just trying to look for ways to work on that and, get them to commit more to the program.
Yeah, Todd, and I think, and while you're in homeschool, I think I've seen this in other situations with other teams, whether it be youth teams or, even certain levels of high school sports and maybe even Division III college athletics. Like there's still like that off season period of time that you coaches struggle with this. So I think your challenge is real for a lot of people, a lot of listeners. Betsy, you feeling anything there?
Yeah, and one, I have a lot of empathy for what your situation is, Todd, and wanting to respect the flexibility that families have, especially the fact that they chose to homeschool their children for a reason. Being respectful of that and also being intentional about, if we're going to develop together, if we're going to compete together, we really do need to share time together. For me, this falls a little bit in the setting expectations bucket of, early on clarifying for parents the need for attendance at practice. I think more important might be being intentional about the conversation of what could likely get in the way of a parent's ability to have their child regularly attend the practice times, to have the conversation proactively of, hey, I acknowledge that you're probably used to a lot of flexibility and that coming to practice is one thing that we're asking for consistently, and that might disrupt the flexibility that you're used to. Here's why it's important. And the conversation I'd love to have with you is when you think about your family's day or your schedule or lack of schedule, what would likely get in the way of you being able to reliably get your kid to practice? And then let's talk through, what could we do or what needs to be true in order to navigate those challenges if and when they arrive. There's no guarantee that they're going to operate with that plan, but I think sometimes simply inviting them to consider what could happen before, it's all of a sudden the day of practice and they're like, yeah, well, I'd rather do this than this. They've already thought through it. And so it increases the likelihood, even somewhat, that maybe they'll actually follow through and get more of the attendance that you're looking for. But big challenge. And I have a lot of empathy for what you're experiencing.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, Todd, I think oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think JP's right. We see this in the public school setting as well, where they're just parents or kids don't value practice or they want to work or whatever it might be. One of the things that we emphasize with our parents is if there's going to be conflicts with the schedule, number one, we try to get the schedule out as soon as we can. We try to be as faithful to that schedule as possible. Obviously, things are going to change during the season. But please let us know, as soon as something is going to come up. And I think that shifts a little bit of the responsibility on them. And we lean into it because it matters when we do lineups and how we practice and how many kids are going to be in the gym and all those sorts of things. But it does sort of imply that we understand that there are perhaps reasons that you won't make it, to a practice or to a game. And it also forces them to articulate them as soon as possible. And sometimes, especially when you start in a new place, you don't always know. Like I had no idea what the club volleyball schedule was actually going to mean for basketball in my first season in Mount Vernon. We found a way to work on it, but I was having parent meetings a month before the season, as soon as they got their club schedule, to say, okay, how do we make this work for, Aaron, who wants to do both of these things? And the parents really appreciate that, just sort of an understanding of their context. But it also gives me the opportunity to say, we have a simple rule that if you're not at the practice before a game, you can't start no matter what. I mean, it doesn't matter what the reason is, funeral, sickness, whatever. So, and we talk about why that is because of preparation for the match and that sort of thing. But at any rate, I think just opening those channels of communication and putting a little bit of responsibility on the parents as soon as possible might help you to be able to navigate that a little bit too. So it's not last minute.
Right.
Yeah, and echoing what Nate said there, anytime we can do collaborative problem solving. So even in a homeschool environment, if I'm a family that has maybe a few different kids and practices are at the same time, and I, as one parent, can't get both kids to the same place or different places at the same time. So even thinking about what barriers currently exist per family or within our team, and then how can we collaboratively problem solve? Like maybe we can carpool with these kids, or maybe, if we shifted like this to this time, that works a little bit better for everyone to give that 15-minute kind of crossover. So identifying what barriers are out there before they become problematic and impact the attendance and therefore the experience of the team. If that's helpful as well, like these are conversations we can have.
Yeah.
Todd, you seem to really you have this standard of we just leashed you here. Like this, it seems like such a reasonable expectation in your mind. Doesn't seem very, as like it's that clear of an expectation for them. When you think about them not meeting this expectation, here you're out there, you're coaching, you're committing all this time. What's the most frustrating part about this situation for you?
I understand that there's going to be times when they miss practice, but it's just hey, we're not going to be at practice today. And as the director, and I'm the varsity coach, so, my team understands that I need to know, but at some of the other levels, they just say, we're not going to be there. And I guess I just need a reason why, right? In our parents handbook, we have, our expectations of practice, and we have, this is a excused practice, this is unexcused practice, right? But I think, listening to Betsy, I think I need to have individual conversations with parents and set my expectations, not just on paper, because they probably don't read it, even though they sign it, they probably don't read it. But I just need to talk to them in person and explain to them that, the coaches set lineups and practices based on the number of people that are going to be there, right? And we have to have all the people there, or at least know they're not going to be there, so we can manage our practices better. So
yeah,
and so go ahead. Sorry,
you got it, Betsy.
I was going to say, if you're going to have those one-on-ones, Todd, a question I love because it's so applicable in a variety of contexts is to say what needs to be true. Like, what needs to be true to enable your child to more consistently attend practice, because it shifts the onus of responsibility, one, to the parent because it's out of your control, but also just the phrasing of the question invites them into possibility thinking, into collaboration. So it doesn't feel combative. There's very little reason to be defensive. It signals like, I am here to help, and you are the only person that can really help us in this situation. So what needs to be true in order for your child to more consistently make it to practice?
I like that.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because you want to raise the standards in there too, and you also are just committing your time. And so I can just, I've been in those situations where there's a lot of frustration. There's kind of maybe like two approaches I often see coaches take. And I think probably the best in these situations is to potentially find some merge of these two and also take out the suggestions that Betsy and Nate were talking about. But one is just you communicate a standard, then enforce it, and have an enforcement standard. I often love to talk about when it comes to like things like attendance, like makeup work. Like if your kid misses schoolwork or you miss work, the work is still there, right? Like you didn't watch the film, you don't know the scout, you didn't get the work done, you're out of condition shape. You have to do some sort of makeup work. So just adding some sort of consequence that says this is actually important to us, so much so that if you miss, you still have to do the work, right? Like if you miss a lesson on math, like you struggle to go jump to the next lesson without having done it. So that's one way to approach it. And the other one is just is the completely opposite. It's just how do I grow it so people want to constantly be there, and just really enjoy it. That kids struggle to miss out on that. And so I think Nate does a really good job of that in his program, creating a place where just everybody's excited to show up. And so I think you've obviously are a big fan of the podcast, so you've listened to all his great ideas too. And so I'm sure you're doing that as well. So keep moving along in that. And hopefully some of the stuff that we're sharing there can help you out.
I will. Appreciate
Good luck, Todd.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. So next up, we're going to move on over to Mackenzie. Mackenzie, I'm going to pull on. Yeah, jump on in here. Mackenzie, for all our listeners, is also she's like the real brains behind this whole podcast operation. She does our editing, and she's also a field hockey coach. So yeah, shoot us with a question, Mackenzie.
Okay. So I am part of a field hockey club, and we have like a ton of really great coaches. They're super knowledgeable about the game, and they really love the girls, and they're great coaches. But I feel like they're missing a little bit of like this, and besides like sharing like little tidbits and stuff from the podcast, or just sending the link to the podcast out to the group chat. I'm wondering, how can I kind of initiate them getting into like more transformational ideas, or making it more of a club-wide thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're trying to kind of grow the conversation around like transformational coaching and just being a little bit more intentional in your coaching within the hockey club.
Yeah, without being so like, hey, we're going to sign up to do this, webinar or whatever it is, or, how do I kind of foster that on my own, just like within conversations, or, you know, is there some activity that I need to plan, you know, something like that.
What's the scariest part for you of like throwing this out there, of making a suggestion or of challenging others and just, you know, talking about this thing, right? I think sometimes even just talking about, you know, how we coach, why we coach the way we do, having these conversations can be uncomfortable. But what's most uncomfortable about that? Because I sense that in you.
I think that, you know, if there's like a behavior issue on the team that somebody's talking about, they typically like feel really strongly about it already. And it's kind of a little bit uncomfortable to like flip it back on them sometimes. So I'm like hesitant to do that. But I feel like being more proactive about it, like in general, it would be better for everyone.
Something that's coming up for me, Mackenzie, when you're talking about this is on an individual basis. And you talk about, we've got a lot of great quality coaches. So it may look different for each individual, but my curiosity goes to, when we're talking about an individual coach, what's important to them? What do they value? Mm-hmm. And then using that as a lever or a catalyst for opening their mind maybe, but also desire to take on some practices that you know would benefit them individually and also the club as a whole. So depending on what someone values, like let's say they value success, right? So because they value success, making a request of them to maybe read something or listen to something that you know equates to or supports the thing that they value, but also in doing the listening or reading supports your agenda of helping them step into a space that maybe they wouldn't willingly seek out on their own. So anytime we can find alignment or crossover between what someone values or holds dear or the goals that they have and what we want, and then making our request in alignment with the thing that they value, we're likely going to get more engagement willingly than if we simply said, you know, we're going to do this webinar. The other thing that comes to mind for me is there something based on what you know about the individual coach, a tool or a technique that is more transformationally based that you can give them that they can apply right away? And in that application and seeing the outcome, they're now more intrigued about like, hey, yeah, that was cool. Do you have anything else like that? Or like, what else do you have? And then flipping I'll say the ownership piece to them to say, oh yeah, if you like that, there's so much out there that's very similar. Let's do this. I'm going to give you this resource, or I'm going to direct you to this site. And I want you to come back with 2 things that you think would be really beneficial, one for yourself and one for the club as a whole. And even starting to create brief interactions, like 5-minute meetings of, we're going to huddle up as a staff before training today. And I want each person to bring one thing that they're going to try that's different, or one thing that they learned recently that they think adds value for the club, like creating that shared responsibility for the growth of the organization so that it's not just on you, but everyone feels a greater investment and responsibility to help continue to elevate the way that you all coach collaboratively. That might be helpful.
Yeah. Mackenzie, I think another way to initiate some conversation is just to engage the players and try to get a handle on how they view their experience. So I think of last year for us, our JV team wasn't quite as aligned as what I had hoped. And so I just met with JV players individually, kind of checking in. How are things going? What are you enjoying? Is there anything that's been frustrating? To get a pulse, first of all, of like, are they feeling and seeing the same things that I'm seeing from a distance, which in some cases I'm overreacting to what I see compared to what they actually are experiencing. So it's a good way for me to check my own perceptions, but it also is much harder, I think, to argue against, well, players really loved it when we did this that one time. You remember when we started with connections before practice? Oh, they loved it, you know? So I don't know a lot of coaches that are going to say, well, we don't want to do that if the players like it, you know? So even if you can kind of tiptoe into some things and get some player feedback, or if there are common themes of, you know, one thing that came out of our conversations last year was that our practices seemed like they were inefficient at times. And so just being able to brainstorm with our JV coaches, like, what are things that you need from me, or what are things that we can do to maximize the 20 minutes when you have the, you know, the courts yourselves or whatever. It just opened a door to conversation, but it didn't necessarily feel like, you know, the boss is coming down to fix things, and it didn't also feel like the players were tattletaling. It just meant the players and coaches are trying to come around creating the best experience that we can, and their input's really important. So that's another way maybe to initiate some conversation about what players actually enjoy, or what they feel benefits them the most in terms of their improvement. And then from there, you can start pulling on threads and see where it goes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mackenzie, how much is there I know when I was on on the journey, or on this journey getting started, I was afraid of being preachy, and I was afraid of, like, who the heck am I to be talking about this? I'm not very good at this, right?
Yeah,
Is there any of it, is any of that resonate?
Yes, for sure. And like, I'm not necessarily, we're all kind of like our own head coaches in the club. So everyone has their own style and, philosophy around what to do, what to do with their team and team building. And, everyone kind of has their own lane. And I just want everyone to kind of have the same foundation for their lane.
Yeah. And I look back at my journey and like kind of really started getting going on this journey in 2016. And I had that insecurities and I didn't want to be preachy. And yet I've got, we're 8 years almost in the podcast, 3 books, and I'm still insecure about being preachy.
Yeah.
And then am I nailing this? Am I getting this right? And so when I go coach, here in Ireland at my kids' local club, first off, nobody knows who the heck I am. Nobody listens to this podcast. Or at least when I got started a few years ago, they did. And so I just started from a place of, first off, I'm still on the journey. Like, I don't have this figured out. And like, so my own personal example is not just about being perfect or being this transformational coach that every kid loves playing for my team more than anybody else's team. It's just about, like, I'm constantly on the journey trying to create a great experience, but I'm asking for feedback from other people, and I'm asking questions. And then sometimes the questions I'm asking, people are like, well, why is he asking that question? But I'm like, it's about the player experience, or how's that landing for them? Or I'm thinking about doing this type of activity, like a parent player practice. What do you all think of that? I don't know. Why would we do that? And then you get to go down this road of explaining why. So I think our own personal example, and then it's just coffees or potentially an invite for a group of, hey, I'm going to do this. Does anybody else want to jump in on me? And I think sometimes, like you said, like I heard you say, like a foundation, like you want everybody's like operating from the same place. That may not be the next step. The next step is probably more likely like you and 2 other coaches at best are going on this journey together.
Yeah, for sure. I think it starts small.
And related to that, JP, is just even opening up a conversation about, is there a benefit to having an academy model where there are consistent values, maybe a consistent, style of play all the way through the different levels of the program, versus just everyone having their own team, and I think just that question, it's a legitimate question. There's a lot that goes into trying to build something like that out. But even as a conversation starter, if you see that somewhere else where there is that consistency top to bottom, I noticed this from, Club XYZ, and I just thought it was really interesting. What do you guys think about that? They may have never considered that before. So even introducing sort of a new paradigm here might create some good conversation as well.
The last thing I'll toss in there, Mackenzie, and I think we're throwing a lot at you as far as possibilities, but
throw it at me.
JP talks about, I don't want to be preachy. And for me, one way to avoid being preachy is to be teachy. But before you teach, we first have to learn. So really occupying the role of the student. When you mention different coaches in your program have different strengths or different lanes, identifying what those are, and they can self-identify. A question I often ask a group of individuals is, what's something that is true about yourself that adds value to the team? And then they'll write down whatever that is. And then I'll ask them to cite a specific example of when is a time that thing has proven to add value. But then what we do is we flip it. So I'll say, I want you to take that same thing that's true about you. Like, I'm a great technical coach. And when is that truth sometimes problematic or detrimental or harmful to the team? Like, how could that become an issue instead of only a strength all the time? Even asking them to flip and reflect in that way, now we've created openings for possibility and growth. And because they ideally want to keep that as a strength, they're more likely or willing or able to do work that helps them turn the potential for it to have a negative impact into more of a value add over time. So let them operate from their strength, let them share that, let others know, so that if they have a question or they want to learn more, they can go to that person. and then flip it so that we all realize there's always going to be work to do. And here's how we can be intentional about that work.
Yeah, makes sense.
Mackenzie, yeah, thanks so much for asking the question. That's a great one, and one that I actually resonate with. So it got me thinking for sure too. Right, that's the end of part 1 of our live Q&A. Next episode, we're going to be back to answer some more questions on giving feedback to assistant coaches and administrators. One questions on what do we do when we are not aligned with our club, athletic department, or front office when it comes to our mission and vision, as well as what's our responsibility as coaches for the athlete's experience. Now, if you want to be in a future live Q&A, well, you need to be subscribed and reading our weekly newsletter. The newsletter shares a weekly article with the practical tools and advice on building team culture. It has the notes to every episode of the podcast, discounts on our online courses, and yes, unique opportunities like being on a live recording with myself, Nate, and Betsy. Thanks for listening in to the Coaching Culture Podcast, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast as well as check out the Culture Builders Podcast. And the Culture Builders Podcast is, typically 2, 3, 4, 5 minute episodes tops, and those drop about 2 to 3 times a week.